He did not ask who had rebuilt the ditch. He did not ask who had kept 83 acres alive through the driest summer in 12 years. He did not even ask why every ranch hand in the yard had stopped working to listen. Nolan Rourke stepped out of a clean black pickup, pointed at Lena Hart and said, "You're fired. Leave the Headgate key on the table and get off this land before sundown." The brass key was already in Lena's hand, mud dried in the lines of her knuckles. Her boots were white with alkali dust. Behind her, water moved through a cedar gate that had been dead for 6 seasons before she touched it. She looked at Nolan, then at the clouds building over the western rim, then at the main ditch where the water had begun to rise half an inch faster than it should. Nolan thought he was ending an argument. He had no idea the ranch had less than 4 hours before the argument became a flood, and Lena knew something he did not. Water did not care who spoke the loudest. It followed the ground. The first time Lena Hart saw Red Willow Ranch, the fields looked like someone had tried to erase them. Gray stubble lay flat under an August sky. The stock pond had pulled away from its banks, leaving a white mineral ring around the mud. Fence posts leaned toward one another, as if they were tired of standing alone. The ranch sat in the high desert of eastern Oregon, where distance could make a place look peaceful even while it was failing. Lena arrived in the passenger seat of a county weed control truck driven by a woman named Carla Mays, who had picked her up outside Burns after the bus left her at a fuel station 40 miles short of where she meant to go. Carla had asked where she was headed. Lena had said, "West until somebody needs what I know." Carla had laughed once, not because it was funny, but because it sounded like something she recognized. "What do you know, water?" Carla looked at her then. Not plumbing, not wells. Not the kind of water that came out of a tap because somebody somewhere had already solved the hard part. Lena knew gravity ditches, diversion boxes, worn headgates, field checks, seep loss, sediment, night turns, and the 1,000 small choices that decided whether water reached the last acre or disappeared into the first 50 feet of thirsty ground. Her father had been a ditch rider on 3 small irrigation systems across Nevada and southeastern Oregon. He had taught her before she was tall enough to lift a shovel without dragging it. "People think water moves where you send it," he used to say. Then he would tap the ground with the toe of his boot. "It moves where the land allows." He had been dead 11 months. The little maintenance company they ran together had been sold for tools and debt. By spring, Lena had a canvas duffel, 2 notebooks, a roll of hand levels wrapped in wool, and no reason to remain in the town where every road held a memory that could stop her walking. She was not running. She was simply no longer anchored. Carla turned off the highway onto a washboard road and pointed through the windshield. "Red Willow is down there. Caleb Rourke owns it. Or the bank does, depending on who is talking." "How bad?" Carla kept her eyes on the road. The kind of bad where a man starts repairing what is visible because he cannot afford to look at what is important. Lena understood that sentence before she ever met Caleb. The truck stopped beside a leaning mailbox with Rourke burned into the wood. Carla wished her luck and drove away in a tail of dust. Lena walked the last half-mile. She saw the ditch first. It crossed the north edge of the property as a shallow scar choked with rabbit brush, tumbleweed, and years of collapsed bank. A line of cottonwoods marked where water had once moved regularly. Most of them were alive only on one side. At the center of the ditch sat an old cedar headgate under a rusted tin shelter. The lifting wheel had been wired in place. The gate boards were split. A brass padlock hung from the chain. Lena set down her duffel and stood looking at it. There were places where abandonment happened suddenly. Fire, foreclosure, death. This was not one of those places. This system had been surrendered one repair at a time. A boot scraped behind her. "You lost?" The man was standing at the edge of the yard with a fencing tool in one hand. Early 40s, narrow through the waist, sun cut into the skin around his eyes. His hat had been repaired with thread darker than the felt. Lena looked from him to the headgate. "I heard you might need help." "From who?" "People who notice dry hay fields." His expression did not change, but his grip shifted on the tool. "What kind of help?" She nodded toward the ditch. "Your upper field is taking water unevenly. The west edge is dead because the old lateral is high. The pond is losing more to a broken return than to evaporation. And somebody chained that headgate shut because the lift screw binds under pressure." He stared at her. She had been on the ranch less than 3 minutes. Finally he said, "You can see all that from the road?" "I walked the ditch." "It is half a mile." "Yes." A gust moved dust across the yard. The man looked at the duffel, then at the roll of tools tied behind it. "Caleb Rourke," he said. "Lena Hart." He did not offer his hand. "What do you want?" "Work. A place to sleep. Enough money to know I am not charity." "I do not have enough money for you to know that. That depends on what the work is." He glanced toward the fields. "We lost the lower diversion 3 springs ago. The main gate seized the year after. I have been pumping from the pond when I can afford diesel. It keeps the near field alive and kills your margin." His jaw tightened. "I know what diesel costs." "I am sure you do." Silence settled between them. From the barn came the dull ring of metal dropped on concrete. Somewhere beyond the sheds, cattle pushed through dry grass with the slow sound of paper being crushed. Caleb said, "You know ditch systems. I know neglected ones. That was not my question." Lena met his eyes. "My father kept 400 small acres alive on water people twice his age said was not enough. I worked beside him for 20 years. I can rebuild your headgate if the main timbers are sound. I can reset your field checks. I can tell you what is salvageable and what is not." He looked past her at the cedar structure. "And if you are wrong, then you will know quickly." That almost changed his expression. "Almost. I can pay $30 a week through September. Bunkhouse room. Meals if May agrees you are not a burden in her kitchen." "Who is May?" "You will find out." Lena picked up her duffel. "I need one condition." Caleb waited. "The water system is mine while I am working it. No one opens a gate, moves a check, clears a bank, or changes a turn without telling me. Not you, not your foreman, not anyone." Caleb looked at her as if he had expected a request for more money and was not sure whether this was better or worse. "You have not seen the whole system." "I have seen enough to know 5 people guessing will do more damage than 1 person measuring." His gaze held hers. Then he walked to the tin shelter, cut the wire around the lifting wheel with his fencing tool, and removed a brass key from his pocket. He unlocked the padlock. The chain fell against the cedar post with a heavy metallic sound. He held out the key. Lena took it. That was the first decision Caleb Rourke made that saved his ranch. He just did not know it yet. May Dobbins was 67, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, and unimpressed by arrivals. She had cooked at Red Willow for 19 years, kept the household ledger for 11, and had an opinion about every person who had ever eaten at her table. She showed Lena the spare bunkhouse room, put 2 folded blankets on the cot, and said, "The window sticks. The stove smokes if you close the damper too early. Orrin snores through walls." "Who is Orrin?" "You will find out." That evening, Lena ate with 5 ranch hands, Caleb and May. No one asked her about the ditch. That did not mean no one was curious. A long-faced man with a scar across his right thumb watched her every time he thought she was not looking. A younger hand named Levi kept glancing at the roll of levels beside her chair. 2 others spoke only to one another. The long-faced man finally said, "Caleb says you are here for the water." Lena took another bite of stew. "That is what he said. You planning to make some?" "No." A spoon stopped against a bowl. She looked at him. "I am planning to stop wasting what you already have." The younger man Levi lowered his head to hide a smile. The long-faced man did not. "Orrin Pike," he said. "So that was Orrin. Lena Hart. I know this ranch. I believe you. I have been opening those field checks 8 years. Then you know where they are." The table went still. Caleb did not intervene. Orrin's face darkened by 1 degree. Lena continued eating. Her father had taught her another thing about water work. Never argue with a man who is waiting for you to prove him wrong. Give him something heavier to carry. At first light, she opened the padlock shelter. The cedar gate was worse up close. The lift screw had been greased with a mixture too thick for the dust in that country. Sand had worked into it until the threads felt like stone. 1 board had bowed inward under old pressure. The sill below was buried in sediment, but the frame was sound. That mattered. Lena spent the morning clearing the approach by hand. She cut rabbit brush from the banks, dragged out a length of broken fence wire, and removed 3 feed sacks packed into the return channel. By 10, sweat had soaked through the back of her shirt. By noon, the old ditch had begun to show its shape. 3 men passed during the morning. All of them slowed, none offered help. Orrin came at one and stood under the shelter with his thumbs in his belt. "You dig all that yourself?" "I did not see anyone else holding the shovel." "That gate will not lift." "It will. The screw is stripped. It is packed. You cannot know that." Lena wiped her hands on her trousers. "The wheel tightens under reverse load. A stripped screw would slip. This one binds. The pressure board is swollen and the sill is buried. If I clear the base and relieve the load, it will move." Orrin looked at the gate, then at her. You sound certain, I sound specific. He left. At 3, May appeared with a jar of water, a piece of bread, and a pry bar. She said all 3 on the bank. Caleb said you might need that. The bread or the bar? May looked at her. Yes. Then she walked back toward the house. Lena worked until the light turned copper. She cleaned the screw threads with kerosene and a stiff brush. She cut 2 temporary braces from old fur. She dug the sill free, 1 shovel at a time, feeling for buried wood with the tip before she levered out each packed layer. When she finally put both hands on the lifting wheel, Caleb was standing 20 feet away. She had not heard him arrive. Do not help, she said. I was not offering. She leaned into the wheel. Nothing. She stopped, reset the brace, turned the wheel backward a quarter turn, then forward. The screws gave a sound like a cough under dirt. The gate moved less than the width of a fingernail. Caleb's eyes shifted. Lena leaned again. The wheel turned. The old cedar board rose 1 inch, then 2. Black water, trapped behind the sill from the upstream holding box, pressed through the opening and curled into the cleared ditch. It was not much, a dark ribbon across dust, but the ditch accepted it. The water ran 6 feet, stopped against a hump of silt, spread, and began to sink. Lena closed the gate. Caleb looked at her. That is all, for today. You opened it 2 inches. I proved it opens. We need water in the field. We need a ditch that can carry it first. He studied the wet line in the dust. How long? 3 days to clear the main run, 2 more to test the laterals. If the diversion above the property still holds, I can put a controlled turn on the upper field by the end of the week. And if the diversion does not hold, then I will tell you before you spend money pretending it does. He was quiet. The last light caught the wet soil and made it almost black. Caleb said, You want supper eventually. That means no? That means I am going to mark where the water stopped while I can still see it. He stood there 1 moment longer. Then he nodded once and walked away. Lena knelt beside the dark edge of damp earth and drove a small willow stake into the bank. The system had spoken, not clearly, but enough. Over the next 3 days, Red Willow Ranch discovered that Lena Hart worked as if time were something physical she could not afford to spill. She rose before the kitchen fire. She walked the ditch with a shovel over one shoulder and her father's field notebook in her pocket. She marked low banks with red cloth and high spots with white. She measured where the ditch lost water to cracked ground and where old roots had broken through the side. She rebuilt 2 field checks from salvaged boards and discarded a third entirely because its placement had never made sense. On the second afternoon, Levi came down with a post hole shovel. May sent me. Did she? No. Lena pointed toward a collapsed section. Start there. Keep the bank wide. Do not dig the center deeper. He worked beside her for an hour before asking, Why not deeper? Because deeper feels useful and usually steals your fall. We need the water moving, not hiding. He nodded as if storing the sentence. On the 3rd day, another hand joined them without explanation. By evening, even Orrin had appeared with a wagon to haul spoil. He did not ask where to put it. He waited for Lena to tell him. The test turn began at 4 the next morning. The upstream cooperative allowed Red Willow 11 hours of flow from the county lateral before the turn passed to the next property. Caleb had not used a full gravity turn in years. The ranch had been selling part of its share to cover operating debt and pumping the rest inefficiently from the pond. Lena opened the cedar headgate slowly. Water entered the ditch brown with disturbed sediment, then cleared. She walked ahead of it. At each field check she watched the front spread, changed the opening by inches, and moved to the next. Levi followed carrying boards. Caleb watched from horseback. Orrin stood at the first split with his arms crossed. The water reached the upper hayfield at 5:23. It moved into the first furrows unevenly, favoring the near side. Lena closed 1 check, opened another, and cut a narrow relief with the shovel. The front corrected. By 7, 12 acres were taking water. By 10, 26. At noon, the far west corner, the part Caleb had called dead, darkened for the first time that season. He dismounted and walked into the field. The water touched the toes of his boots. He looked across the wet ground toward Lena. How much did we lose? Too much. His face tightened. Where? 2 bank leaks, 1 bad lateral. The first 100 yards drank more than it carried. That sounds like failure. It sounds like a test. She pointed toward the west corner, but the water got there. Caleb looked down. A thin blade of dormant grass had begun to lift under the wet soil. Lena said, Give me 2 more turns. For what? To make the 3rd one count. The second turn watered 39 acres. The third watered 52. By the fourth, Red Willow was using almost the same allocation that had once barely reached the near field to carry moisture across 68 acres of hay ground and pasture. There was no miracle in it. There were boards set at the right height, banks packed before they leaked, turns timed instead of guessed. A return channel cleared so water could be recovered instead of lost. There was a woman walking in the dark with a shovel, closing one gate before opening the next because pressure had to go somewhere. There were notes, there was patience, there was the ground. At breakfast after the fourth turn, May set a ledger beside Lena's bowl. "What is this? D's expense for the last 3 summers." Lena opened it. The numbers were worse than she expected. May tapped one column. "If this holds, that line changes. It will not disappear." "I did not say disappear." Lena looked at her. May's expression softened by the smallest amount. "Caleb has forgotten the difference between bad and fatal," she said. "You may be reminding him." Across the table, Orrin was staring at his coffee. "He said that west lateral still runs shallow." Lena waited. "I know where there is a load of clay," he continued. "Good packing clay, North Cut." She closed the ledger. "Can you bring it after breakfast?" Orrin nodded. That was not an apology. It was more useful. For 2 weeks the ranch changed in increments so small that no single one looked like hope. The upper field stayed green at the roots. The pond level stopped dropping as fast once Lena closed the broken return. The cattle began using a pasture Caleb had written off in June. Levi learned to read the color of moving water for sediment. Orrin showed Lena an abandoned lateral hidden under sage and admitted it had once served the lower meadow before a flood took part of the bank. She walked it with him. Halfway down, she stopped beside a buried turnout and scraped dirt from an iron hinge. This could work. Orrin looked at the collapsed line. "Not this year." "Why? It is too far gone." "That is a description, not a reason." He looked at her. She smiled without warmth. He had used that sentence on her in a different form every day since she arrived. Now she handed it back. They spent 3 days reopening the lower lateral. On the 4th evening, water reached the meadow. Caleb stood at the fence while cattle moved toward the new grass. He did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "My mother planted willow along this line." Lena looked at the trees. They were old, hollow in places, but alive. "That why it is called Red Willow?" "No. Ranch already had the name. She thought it needed to earn it." He rested his forearms on the fence. "She died when I was 20. Lena understood the quiet after that. Some facts were not invitations. They were weights a person set down between you to see whether you would make them carry the weight again by asking questions. She did not. The cattle lowered their heads into grass that had been dry a week earlier. Caleb said, "You were right about the lower line." "I know." He glanced at her. She added, "Orrin was right that it was a lot of work. That sounds almost generous." "Do not spread it around." The corner of his mouth moved. It was the first time she saw him smile. The first sabotage looked like carelessness. Lena found the north field check open 6 inches wider than she had left it. The change had happened during a night turn. It sent too much water into one lateral and starved the next. No crop was lost, but the low corner flooded ankle deep and the far section received almost nothing. She reset the board and marked its position with charcoal. At breakfast she said, "Who opened the north check after midnight?" No one answered. Orrin looked at Levi. Levi looked offended. Caleb put down his fork. Lena said, "I am not asking for a confession. I am asking because the schedule only works if the gates stay where they are set." One of the older hands, Kent, cleared his throat. "I rode past around 2. Board looked low. Did you move it?" "No." "Did you see anyone?" "No." Lena nodded and returned to her food. That afternoon she cut small notches into the backs of every critical board. Nothing visible from the field, just a private reference she could feel in the dark. 2 nights later, someone moved the waste gate beside the pond. Again, not enough to cause obvious damage. Enough to drain several hours of recovered water into a dry swale. Lena found the wet trail before dawn. This time she said nothing. She walked the system twice. She checked hoof prints near the gate, boot marks along the bank, the shape of mud pressed into the grass. The print was broad and worn at the outside heel. Orrin's boots wore evenly. Levi's were too small. Kent had a bad left knee and dragged that foot. The print did not belong to any of them. At supper, Lena watched a hand named Bram Cole lean back in his chair and cross one boot over the other. The outside heel was worn almost flat. Bram was 38, restless, and convinced that every decision made without him was an insult. He had worked at Red Willow 2 seasons. Before that, he had moved through 6 ranches in 7 years. He had been quiet around Lena, too quiet. She waited. The third incident came 4 days later. A stone had been jammed under the cedar headgate where it met the sill. If Lena had raised the gate under full pressure, the board could have twisted against the frame. Maybe it would only have cracked. Maybe the old lift screw would have taken the strain. Maybe the entire gate would have failed. She found the stone during her pre-turn inspection. She held it in her palm for a long moment, then she carried it to the bunkhouse and placed it on Bram's bed. No note, no accusation, just the stone. He found her near the lower meadow an hour later. "You put something in my room?" Lena kept packing a bank seam with the back of her shovel. "I returned it. I do not know what you are talking about." "Then it should not bother you." Bram stepped closer. "You think you run this place now. I run the water. Caleb lets you give orders because a few fields turned green." Lena planted the shovel and looked at him. "No, Caleb lets me give orders because when I am wrong the ground shows it. When you are wrong you hide a stone in a gate and hope the break happens after you walk away." His face changed, only slightly. "Enough. You have proof? I have a ranch that cannot afford you proving me right." He stared at her, then he laughed once. "You should be careful walking ditches alone at night." The words were quiet, not quite a threat. Worse because they were designed to leave room for denial. Lena felt fear arrive cleanly in her body, cold under the ribs. She did not move. "You should be careful confusing silence with permission," she said. Bram's eyes held hers. Then he walked away. Lena finished packing the seam. Her hands were steady until he disappeared over the rise. After that, they shook. She hated that, not the fear itself. Fear was information. She hated that he had managed to enter the work with her, that for the next 3 nights every sound beside the ditch would have his shape until she proved otherwise. She did not tell Caleb. Part of that was pride. Part was strategy. Caleb would dismiss Bram immediately, and Bram would leave angry with knowledge of every weak point in the system. Lena preferred an enemy where she could see him. May disagreed. She found the stone because she found everything. "You are being stupid," May said. Lena sat at the kitchen table repairing the leather strap on her level case. "That is possible. Do not make me admire your honesty while you ignore my point. I know what he is doing, and Caleb does not. Caleb knows somebody moved gates." "That is not the same." Lena pulled the needle through leather. "If I tell Caleb about the threat, Bram is gone by noon." "Yes. And then? Then he is gone." "No. Then he knows I got him fired. He knows the headgate. He knows the diversion. He knows where the banks are thin. He can do more damage from outside this ranch than inside it." May's mouth tightened. "You have thought about this. Yes, that does not make it wise." "No." May sat across from her. The kitchen clock ticked. Finally she said, "Your father teach you to carry trouble alone?" Lena kept her eyes on the strap. "He taught me not to hand a problem to someone before I knew what problem I was handing them." May studied her. "Those are not the same lesson." Lena tied off the thread. She did not answer. The drought tightened in September. The county reduced delivery hours by 12% across the lateral. Men who had been polite at spring meetings began arguing over minutes. Headgates upstream opened before scheduled turns and closed late. Every theft looked small from one property and devastating by the time the loss reached the bottom of the system. Red Willow sat near the end. Lena adjusted. She shortened field sets. She watered at night when wind loss dropped. She stopped trying to make every acre equal and protected the sections with the best chance of carrying growth into winter. Caleb disliked that choice. "We need the south pasture. We need the hay more." "The cattle are already pressing the north field, then rotate them tighter. That pasture is always carried September." "This September does not care what it always did." His eyes hardened. "You are telling me to let 40 acres go. I am telling you to stop spending water on ground that cannot return it before frost." They stood beside the ditch in heat that made the horizon move. Caleb looked toward the south pasture. His father had fenced it. His mother had planted cottonwoods at the corner. Lena knew enough now to understand that acreage was not measured only in yield. "That field matters," he said. "I know." "No, you do not." Lena let the sentence sit. Then she said, "My father's last contract was a 60-acre alfalfa place outside Winnemucca. Third-generation ground. The family kept watering a lower bench because their grandfather had cleared it by hand. The bench took a quarter of their share and returned almost nothing. Dad told them to stop. They fired us." Caleb looked at her. "The next year they lost the upper stand too," she continued. They were not wrong to love the bench. They were wrong to make the rest of the farm pay for that love. The wind pressed her shirt against her back. Caleb looked again at the south pasture. What happens if we protect the hay? We finish the season with enough feed to avoid buying at winter prices, and if the winter is hard, then you will be glad we did not water a memory. His jaw flexed. For a moment, Lena thought he would overrule her. He did not. Close it, he said. She closed the south turnout that evening. Caleb watched from horseback until the last water drained away. After that, he did not speak to her for 2 days. He still brought coffee to the Headgate at 4 in the morning. That was how Lena learned the difference between anger and abandonment. By mid-September, word had reached town. It began with the kind of praise that sounded like doubt. People said Caleb Rourke had hired a woman who could make water climb uphill. They said Red Willow was green again, which was not true. Parts of it were green. Parts were deliberately brown. That distinction was too useful to survive gossip. They said Lena slept in the ditch house. She did not yet. They said she had found a hidden spring. She had found a broken return. They said Caleb was letting her decide which fields lived. That part was true. At the feed store in Burns, Lena heard 2 men discussing her from the next aisle. Rourke is desperate. He has been desperate for years. Desperate is one thing. Handing your water to a drifter is another. Lena stood with a coil of gate chain in her hands. The second man said, Warren Slate offered him a clean exit last winter. Good money for the land and the water share. Caleb would die before he sold to Slate. Then he may get the chance. They laughed quietly. Lena bought the chain. Outside, she found Caleb loading mineral blocks into the truck. Who is Warren Slate? Caleb did not look up. Neighbor north of the rim, the one buying water shares. His shoulders changed. Not much. Who told you? Town. Town talks, usually around something. He slid the last block into the truck bed. Slate owns 6,000 acres and leases another 4. He has a packing contract, better equipment, more capital, and less patience than weather. He offered to buy Red Willow, yes, and the water, that is what he wants. Lena understood. Red Willow's land mattered, but its senior water share mattered more. Combined with Slate's upstream acreage, it would give him control over a longer section of the lateral and a stronger position in every dry year allocation fight. How many times has he offered? 3. What did you say? No, that all. That is the useful part. They drove home in silence. Halfway to the ranch, Caleb said, Slate thinks every problem is a price waiting to be named. And you? I think some prices are just another way of saying you do not understand what you are buying. Lena looked out at the sage. Her father had said something similar about water rights. On paper, a share was a number. On the ground, it was mornings, arguments, wet boots, neighbors, old agreements, and the distance between a gate opening upstream and a field darkening miles below. The document was not the water. It was only permission to fight for it. Warren Slate came to Red Willow 3 days later. He arrived in a silver truck with no dust inside the wheel wells. He was in his late 50s, wide through the chest, with clean hands and a voice trained to sound reasonable. Caleb met him on the porch. Lena was repairing a turnout board within earshot. Slate talked about markets, winter feed, debt, the county's likely allocation review. He never mentioned buying the ranch until 15 minutes into the conversation, which told Lena he had planned the order. I am not here to pressure you, he said. Caleb leaned against the porch post. You drove 12 miles on a road you hate to tell me that, Slate smiled. I heard the water is moving again. It is. That changes the appearance of things. Appearance? Short-term improvement can make a man overvalue a long-term position. Lena kept working. Slate's eyes moved toward her. You must be Miss Hart. Lena, I hear you have done impressive work. She looked up. I did necessary work. He smiled again, smaller. Necessary can be impressive, Caleb said. What do you want, Warren? Slate turned back to him. To keep the offer open. The same number through October. After that, I reassess based on winter risk. You can reassess now. Caleb, no. Slate's reasonableness thinned. You are carrying debt on dry ground. I am carrying cattle on watered ground for 1 season. Lena set down the board. Slate looked at her. She said 68 acres on gravity flow, lower meadow reopened, pond recovery stabilized. Diesel draw cut by more than half since August. Caleb turned his head slightly. He had not heard the full list. Slate's eyes sharpened. That is good work. It is measurable work. And does it service his debt? No, Lena said. It keeps him from increasing it for feed and fuel. A pause. Slate put on his gloves. You have confidence. No, I have notes. For the first time, he stopped smiling. He left 5 minutes later. Caleb watched the silver truck disappear down the road. You cut diesel by more than half, 57% against May's ledger for the same period last year. You did not tell me. You did not ask. He looked at her. That is something a person mentions. I planned to when I had a full month. You have a full month. Then I am mentioning it. Caleb shook his head. It was not irritation. Not exactly. You and May are dangerous together. Yes. That evening, Caleb brought the ranch ledger to the ditch house. It was the first time he showed Lena the whole shape of Red Willow. The numbers were not fatal. That was almost worse. Fatal numbers made decisions simple. These numbers offered just enough room to continue making expensive mistakes. The ranch had survived 3 weak hay years, 1 equipment failure, high diesel costs, and a cattle market that punished every sale Caleb had been forced to make. He had borrowed against the next calf crop twice. He was not bankrupt. He was close enough to hear it breathing. Lena worked through the ledger with May for 2 nights. They did not invent a rescue. They found margins, fuel saved through gravity irrigation, hay protected by closing the south pasture, a feed purchase avoided if the final cutting held, a possible lease on the lower meadow once water reliability was proven. Small numbers, but small numbers repeated across a season became structure. At the bottom of a page, Lena wrote 1 sentence. The ranch does not need a miracle. It needs the leaks to stop agreeing with one another. Caleb read it the next morning. He said nothing. He tore the page out carefully and folded it into his shirt pocket. The first frost came early, not a killing freeze, a warning. Lena woke at 2:15 because the wind had dropped. In high desert country, silence could be weather. She dressed and walked to the north field. The temperature had fallen 12 degrees since midnight. Water was still moving through 2 laterals from the night turn. At that temperature, the grass would hold, but exposed banks could crust, slowing flow at the narrow checks. She found the first problem near the lower split. A mat of cut weeds had collected against the board. Water backed up behind it, nearly level with the bank. She pulled the weeds free. The water surged. Farther down, the return was rising too quickly. Someone had closed the pond waste gate. Lena ran. She reached the gate and threw her weight against the wheel. It did not move. Mud had been packed into the threads. Not accidental mud. Wet clay rammed under the collar. Bram. The bank upstream softened under pressure. A dark line formed along the outer edge. If it cut through, the return would empty across the service road and into the bunkhouse yard. Lena grabbed the iron bar from the shelter and struck the collar. Once, twice. The third blow cracked the clay. She turned the wheel. It moved half a turn. The gate opened. Water dropped through the waste channel with a roar. Behind her, the bank gave a low tearing sound. Lena shoved the bar into the split and packed dirt with her boots, but the seam widened. A lantern appeared on the road, then another. Caleb arrived first, Orrin behind him, Levi running with 2 shovels. No one asked what happened. Lena pointed. Sandbags from the barn. Pack from the dry side. Do not stand below the cut. They worked 40 minutes in frost and black water. May came in a coat over her nightdress, driving the old flatbed with empty feed sacks and a load of packing clay. By 3:30 the bank held. The water level dropped. Only then did Caleb see the clay around the gate collar. He crouched and touched it. This was put here. Yes, he stood. Who? Lena looked toward the bunkhouse. Bram was not among the men on the bank. Caleb's face emptied. He walked away without another word. They found Bram's room stripped, his bedroll gone, his horse missing. On the blanket lay Lena's stone. Bram had not only left. He had waited for a cold night, closed the waste gate, packed the wheel, and walked away, knowing the water would rise after everyone slept. Caleb sent Orrin and Kent after him. They found the horse at dawn near the county road. Bram had been picked up by a truck. No one saw which one. Caleb stood in the yard holding the stone. I should have known. Lena's hands were raw from packing the bank. One knuckle had split. You knew somebody was moving gates. I should have known enough, so should I? He looked at her. You knew it was him. Yes. And you did not tell me. No. Anger came into his face, controlled and more dangerous for it. Why? Because I thought I could contain him. This is not a ditch problem. It became one. He threatened the ranch. He threatened me first. Caleb went still. Lena had not meant to say it, but there it was. What did he say? It does not matter now. It matters to me. Because you own the ranch? Because you work here? The words landed harder than they should have. Lena looked away. Caleb said, What did he say? She told him. Not dramatically. Just the sentence beside the lower meadow. You should be careful walking ditches alone at night. Caleb closed his hand around the stone until his knuckles whitened. You should have told me. Probably. That is not an answer. It is the honest one. He turned toward the bunkhouse, then back. You do not get to decide alone which dangers belong to everyone. Lena's first instinct was to resist. It rose fast and familiar. My work, my problem, my judgment. Then she looked at the repaired bank, at Orrin asleep against a fence post, his trousers wet to the knee, at May carrying muddy sacks toward the flatbed, at Levi coiling rope with both hands shaking from cold. The danger had already belonged to everyone. She had simply been the last to admit it. You are right, she said. Caleb stared at her. He had prepared for an argument. She almost felt sorry for disappointing him. I will tell you next time. There will not be a next time. There is always a next time. It just may not be Bram. He looked toward the ditch. That is not comforting. It was not meant to be. The sun came over the rim, pale and cold. Caleb held out the stone. Lena shook her head. Keep it. Why? So you remember a leak is easier to stop before it reaches the bank. He put the stone in his coat pocket. For the next week, he rode every night turn with her. He never said it was protection. She never said she knew. October changed the ranch in ways that were easier to count than to name. The final hay cutting came in 14% heavier than May had projected in August. The lower meadow held enough late growth to carry the smaller cattle through the first cold weeks. The diesel tank remained half full at a time of year when Caleb usually ordered another delivery on credit. No single number saved Red Willow. Together, they bought time. Time was the rarest resource on the property. People began arriving to see why the ranch still had time. Miriam Voss, a respected sheep rancher on the irrigation board, walked the full system with Lena and asked questions sharp enough to prove she understood the answers. At the headgate, Miriam ran one hand along the cedar frame. This should have failed. It almost did. What kept it? The frame was built better than the maintenance. Miriam nodded. That sentence applies to half the county. At the next cooperative meeting, Warren Slate proposed reviewing underused water shares, a policy that would pressure small ranches to lease or sell what they could not efficiently carry. Miriam asked Lena to explain Red Willow. Lena gave the room 3 numbers, 57% less diesel. 16 additional acres recovered through the lower lateral, 4 full turns completed without taking 1 unauthorized minute. Slate said 1 successful season did not make a sustainable ranch. Lena closed her notebook. No, but it changes who gets to call the ranch impossible. The room stayed quiet, not because everyone liked her, because the numbers had forced them to recalculate. On the drive home, Caleb said, You hate rooms. I hate rooms where the ground is not available to correct anyone. You did well. I gave numbers. That is what doing well looks like in those rooms. She looked out at the black road. After a mile, she said, Slate will push harder. Yes. Why? Because the water share is worth more now that we proved the system can use it. So fixing the ranch made him want it more. Most improvements do. Lena considered that. Her father had taught her to repair physical systems. He had not taught her what happened when a repair changed the value of the thing around it. That lesson came from Red Willow. The serious cold arrived in the second week of November. By then, the irrigation season was nearly closed, but Lena still needed one final pond recovery cycle before freezing weather locked the upper ditch. The recovered water would not irrigate a field. It would stabilize the stock pond and reduce winter pumping from the well. The forecast called for 20 degrees. The temperature reached 9. At midnight, ice began building around the narrowest return check. Lena moved her cot into the tin Headgate shelter. May brought blankets and refused to discuss them. Caleb brought coffee at 2. Orrin brought a shovel at 3 and said he could not sleep, which was a lie. The 3 of them worked in shifts, breaking edge ice, reducing flow, and keeping the return moving without sending a surge into the pond. At 4:30, the lifting wheel froze. Lena heated a strip of iron in a small brazier and held it against the collar, careful not to shock the old metal. Caleb watched her hands. You have done this before. Different gate, colder night. How cold? 6 below. This feels colder. That is because you are complaining. Orrin laughed into his coat. Caleb looked at him. Orrin stopped. The wheel loosened. Lena turned it 1/4. Water slowed. The system held until dawn. When sunlight reached the cottonwoods, the stock pond stood 8 inches higher than it had the week before. 8 inches did not look like survival. By February it would. Caleb stood beside Lena under the shelter. You could have let the well handle winter. We would pay for that in electricity and pump wear. You could have slept. I did. 20 minutes. That is not sleep. It counted. He looked at the pond. Then he said, my brother is coming next week. Lena glanced at him. You have a brother? Nolan. You say that like a diagnosis. Caleb almost smiled. He lives in Boise. Commercial property management. He has opinions. About water. About everything that can be entered in a spreadsheet. May will like him. May has known him since he was 9. That was not my point. Nolan Rourke arrived on a clear Monday in a black pickup that looked wrong in the yard. He was taller than Caleb, heavier through the shoulders, and dressed like a man who spent money to avoid weather. He embraced his brother with real affection that mattered. Lena saw it from the ditch and revised the story she had already begun telling herself. Nolan was not a stranger circling a weak ranch. He was family. Family could do more damage than strangers precisely because love gave them a key. At supper, Nolan asked practical questions. Hay tonnage, calf count, debt service, water allocation. He listened carefully to May's answers and wrote numbers in a small notebook. Then he asked Lena, how long do you plan to stay, through winter and after? I have not decided, he nodded. You have done remarkable work. Thank you. The fuel savings are real, yes. The feed position is better, yes. And the ranch is still carrying more debt than its current herd can service. Caleb put down his fork. Nolan. What? We are all discussing the same operation. No, you are discussing it at dinner with a person who did not ask. Nolan looked at Lena. I meant no offense. I am not offended. That was true. She was alert. Later, he found her in the kitchen washing a cup. Caleb is protective of people when he feels responsible for them, he said. Lena dried the cup. Is that what you think is happening? I think my brother has been alone with a failing operation for a long time. Then someone arrived and changed the direction of a few important numbers. A few? Nolan raised one hand. Important numbers. I said that. What do you want from me? He appreciated directness. She could see it. I want you to understand that improving the water system does not erase the debt. I understand. It may make selling more rational, not less. The water share is stronger now. The land presents better. Slate's offer could improve. There it is. What? The reason you came. His expression tightened. I came because Caleb was thrown from a horse in March and did not tell me until June. I came because May sent me numbers he refused to send. I came because loving someone does not require agreeing with the way they are losing. Lena held his gaze. That answer was honest enough to complicate her anger. Nolan continued. I am not asking you to sabotage the ranch. I am asking you not to confuse being needed with the operation being viable. The two are not the same. Good, but neither are struggle and failure. He looked at her. No, he said, they are not. For 4 days, Nolan and Caleb moved around each other like men carrying old furniture through a narrow room. They spoke in low voices. They stopped when someone entered. They argued once in the equipment shed, not loudly, but with the precision of an argument repeated for years. Lena heard Nolan say, you do not get extra points for losing slowly. Caleb answered, and you do not get wisdom from leaving. Silence followed. The next morning, Nolan drove to town. He returned with a folder from the bank. That afternoon, Caleb saddled a horse and rode north to check winter fence. He came back at dusk on Oren's horse, hunched forward, one arm held against his ribs. His own horse followed with a broken rein. The ground had given way near a wash. The horse fell. Caleb hit rock. May took one look and ordered the truck. At the clinic in Burns, the doctor found 3 cracked ribs, a fractured wrist, and a concussion serious enough to require observation overnight. Caleb hated every part of being kept there. Nolan became temporary authority because the bank papers, insurance contacts, and ranch accounts needed someone present. That was how the hook began. Not with evil, with paperwork. The next morning, a storm warning came through the cooperative radio. Warm rain would fall on frozen ground across the western rim. The county expected fast runoff. The main lateral was supposed to remain closed for winter, but Red Willow's upper diversion still held residual water behind a temporary bank Lena had built to protect the cedar headgate from ice pressure. She walked the ditch at noon. The bank was firm, the sky was not. She told Oren to stage sandbags near the diversion and keep the waste channel clear. Nolan heard. We are not spending labor on an irrigation system in November. We are protecting the headgate. The headgate is closed. The ground upstream is frozen. Rain will run instead of sink. If the diversion takes the first surge, pressure comes down this ditch. Then open everything. No. He looked at her. Excuse me. If we open everything before the surge, we send uncontrolled flow through banks that are freezing at night. The lower return cannot carry it. We need to bleed the holding box in stages and keep the wastegate ready. Nolan looked toward the sky. How certain are you? Certain enough to put men there now. How much will this cost? Less than rebuilding the ditch in spring. That is not a number. Weather does not wait for accounting. His face changed. The sentence hit whatever part of him had spent years watching Caleb make expensive decisions without numbers. I am responsible for this property while my brother is in the clinic. You are responsible for not destroying what you do not understand. The yard went quiet. Orrin stopped loading sacks. Levi stood beside the flatbed. Nolan stepped closer. You were hired to repair and operate the water system. Yes, the irrigation season is over. The system still exists, and so does the payroll. Lena felt the brass key against her palm. Nolan said, "You are done. Leave the key on the table. I will pay through the week." She stared at him. He mistook the silence for resistance. His voice hardened. "You're fired. Get off this land before sundown." Every man in the yard heard it. May stood in the kitchen doorway. Orrin's face went blank. Levi looked at Caleb's truck as if expecting it to appear. Lena looked west. The clouds had lowered. She could smell rain before it reached the ranch. She said, "You need to lower the holding box by 6 inches before the first runoff arrives, not empty. 6 inches. Keep the wastegate clear. Do not open the lower split until the first surge passes." Nolan's jaw tightened. "I heard your recommendation." "No, you heard words. I need to know you understand them. I understand that you are no longer employed here." Lena closed her hand around the key. Then she walked to the tin shelter. She checked the lifting wheel. She cleared one last clump of frozen weeds from the waste channel. She placed the brass key on the kitchen table beside May's ledger, and she packed her duffel. May followed her to the bunkhouse. "You are not leaving. I was fired by a man who cannot tell a turnout from a fence brace. He has authority until Caleb returns. He has paper. Today those are the same." May stood in the doorway. Rain tapped once against the window. Then again. "Where will you go?" "Carla Mays lives outside Burns. She told me to call if I got stranded." "You did not get stranded." "No. What do you call this?" Lena folded her father's notebook into the duffel. "A grade change." May's eyes narrowed. "That is a terrible joke." It was not a joke. Lena carried the bag to the road at 3:15. Levi offered the flatbed. She refused. Orrin said, "You were right about the storm." "I know. I mean, Nolan knows it too." "No, he knows there is a storm." Orrin looked at the western rim. "What do we do?" "What I told him. And if he says different?" Lena looked at Orrin. "For the first time since August, the water is not mine." She walked away. Carla picked her up at the mailbox 40 minutes later. Rain had begun in earnest. From the passenger seat, Lena watched Red Willow disappear behind the ridge. She told herself she had done what she was paid to do. The hay was in. The pond was stable. The ditch had carried a full season. A system did not become yours because you repaired it. A place did not become yours because people started making room at the table. A key did not mean ownership. It only meant access. 3 miles from the ranch, Carla slowed. Water was running across the road in thin silver sheets. "Fast," Carla said. Lena looked toward the western rim. The warm rain had reached the frozen slopes sooner than predicted. Every shallow draw would be moving. She pictured the upper diversion, the temporary bank, the holding box, 6 inches of space that might or might not exist. "Turn around." Carla looked at her. "You sure?" "No." Carla turned around. By the time they reached the Red Willow mailbox, the ditch along the road was full. Lena jumped out before the truck stopped. She ran the half-mile to the yard. The brass key was no longer on the kitchen table. Nolan had it. He stood under the tin shelter with Orrin and Levi while water hammered the closed headgate from upstream. The holding box was nearly full. Too full. "You did not lower it," Lena said. Nolan turned. "I opened the wastegate. Not enough. It is fully open. Then it is blocked." Orrin shouted from the channel, "Debris at the culvert!" A mat of sage, ice, and old branches had jammed against the narrow outlet below the wastegate. Water could not leave fast enough. The upper bank began to shed dirt. Nolan looked at Lena. For 1 second, his face showed exactly what he had been trying to avoid since he arrived. Not financial fear, helplessness. "What do we do?" Lena held out her hand. "The key." He gave it to her. No argument. That mattered too. She unlocked the chain and moved to the wheel. "Orrin, take Levi and clear the culvert from downstream. Rope both of you. May, bring every empty feed sack. Nolan, get the flatbed above the bank, not below it. We need weight on the north side." Nolan moved. The headgate shook under pressure. Lena opened it 1 inch. Water punched through. She closed it half, waited, opened again. The goal was not to release the flood. It was to make the pressure choose a safer path. Water entered the main ditch in a hard brown line. The bank groaned. "Now!" Lena shouted. Orrin pulled debris from the culvert. The waste channel surged. The holding box dropped 2 inches. Not enough. The upper bank split along a seam Lena had packed in September. Mud pushed through. Nolan came beside her with a shovel. "Where?" She pointed. He entered the water without hesitation. They packed the seam together. Rain blinded them. The old cedar gate flexed. Levi shouted that more debris was coming. Lena made the decision she had feared all season. "Open the lower split!" Orrin stared. "That floods the south pasture." "I know. The south pasture Caleb had closed. The field that carried his mother's cottonwoods. The memory they had chosen not to water. Now it was the only ground broad enough to absorb the surge without destroying the yard or the main ditch." Orrin ran. Lena opened the headgate 4 inches. Water struck the ditch and raced toward the split. For 20 seconds nothing visible changed. Then the holding box dropped. 6 inches. The upper seam stopped widening. Across the ranch, dark water spread into the south pasture. It flattened dry grass. It circled the old cottonwoods. It carried branches, silt, and ice into ground. Caleb had refused to sell and agreed to sacrifice. The main ditch held. The headgate held. The ranch held. They worked until dark. At 7, Nolan sat on an overturned trough, soaked to the skin, mud to his waist. Lena stood under the shelter with the brass key. He looked at her. "I was wrong, yes." He nodded. "No defense, no qualification. I thought opening the waste gate was the safe choice. It would have been if the outlet were clear. You told me to check it." I told Orrin. "You told me the system needed labor." "Yes." He looked toward the south pasture. "Did we lose it?" "No. It may actually benefit from the silt if the freeze stays off 2 days." He laughed once. It was exhausted and without humor. "Of course." A truck entered the yard. Caleb sat in the passenger seat, pale, left arm in a sling, fury already visible through the windshield. May had called the clinic. The nurse had apparently failed to stop him leaving. He stepped down carefully. Nolan stood. Caleb looked at the mud, the headgate. The water spread across the south pasture, then at Lena. "What happened?" Nolan answered before she could. "I fired her." Caleb stared at him. "Then the runoff hit. I handled it wrong. She came back." Caleb's eyes moved to Lena. "You came back. The ditch was rising." "You were fired." The ditch did not know that. Something passed across Caleb's face. Pain, relief, anger, maybe all 3. Nolan reached into his wet coat and pulled out the bank folder. "I also called Warren Slate this morning." Caleb went still. "I told him we might reopen the offer." The yard seemed to contract. Nolan held up one hand. "I did not sign anything. I was trying to create an option." "You created one for him," Caleb said. "I know." Nolan looked at Lena. "And I destroyed the one standing in front of me." He gave Caleb the folder. Then he said, "The ranch needs her. The numbers need her. And if you are too stubborn to make that formal, then you are exactly as bad at this as I thought." Caleb looked from his brother to Lena. Rain dripped from the shelter roof. May said, "Everyone is going inside before one of you decides pneumonia is a financial strategy." That ended the conversation for the night. It did not end the question. The next morning, the storm had passed. The south pasture held a shallow sheet of water under pale sunlight. The ditch banks were scarred but intact. The cedar headgate leaned 1 degree more than before, yet the frame remained sound. Lena walked the system with Caleb. He moved slowly because of his ribs. At the lower split, he looked across the flooded pasture. "My mother would have liked this. The flooding, the trees getting water when nobody intended it." Lena looked at the cottonwoods. "They may lose a few roots if it freezes tonight." She would have said that was a poor way to receive a compliment. They continued walking. At the headgate, Caleb held out his hand. Lena placed the brass key in it. He closed his fingers around it. Then he opened them again and gave it back. "Nolan could not fire you. He had temporary authority. He did not own the ranch. Authority does not always wait for ownership." Caleb looked at the old gate. "That is what he thinks this place is. Authority, numbers, responsibility. He is not wrong about all of it. No. He loves me, I know. He is still wrong." "Yes." Caleb breathed carefully. "I should have shown you the full plan earlier." "What plan?" He took a folded paper from his coat. Not a contract, a set of figures in his cramped handwriting. Fuel savings, feed avoided, estimated pond pumping reduction, projected income from leasing recovered meadow acreage. At the bottom, a proposed percentage. Lena read it twice. "What is this?" An operating partnership. She looked at him. You wrote this before the storm, 3 days before Nolan came. Why did you not show me? I was checking the numbers. With who? May, then Miriam Voss. She knows a lawyer. Lena looked at the paper again. The percentage was not symbolic. It was enough to make the work hers in a way wages never could. You want me to own part of Red Willow. I want you to own part of the operation. Land structure takes longer. Water Authority does not. She held the paper. Because I came back? No. Because I saved the ditch? No. Caleb looked directly at her. Because by the second full turn in August you were making decisions for the next season, not just the next hour. People who plan for a place after their own job ends are already carrying more than a job. The wind moved softly through the cottonwoods. Lena thought of her father's notebook. Of the maintenance company sold one wrench at a time. Of all the gates they had repaired for people who thanked them, paid them, and forgot their names by the next drought. What happens when we disagree? She asked. We already disagree. What happens when neither of us gives in? We measure, and if the numbers do not answer it. Caleb looked at the ground. Then we walk it. That was the right answer. Not because it promised ease, because it named the method. Lena folded the paper. I want a real contract. Yes. I want defined control of water operations. Yes. I want access to all financial records that affect land, herd, water, and feed decisions. Caleb hesitated. Then, yes, I want Nolan to review it. That surprised him. Why? Because he sees failure earlier than you do. He sees it everywhere. That is why we do not let him decide. It is also why we do not ignore him. Caleb considered that. You are going to be difficult. So are you. He held out his right hand. His left was in the sling. Lena shook it. The brass key pressed between their palms. Nolan left 2 days later. Before he did, he found Lena under the tin shelter, replacing a cracked brace. I owe you an apology. Yes, he almost smiled. I fired you because I thought the cleanest action was the responsible one. You were trying to reduce uncertainty. I reduce uncertainty for a living. Land does not like that. No, he looked at the cedar frame. Caleb told me about the partnership. He told you I wanted you to review it? He did. What do you think? Nolan took time before answering. I think the ranch was unfinanceable in August. I think it is barely viable now. I think barely viable is still viable. And I think every model I ran gets worse if you leave. That is almost warm. Do not tell May. She already knows. He nodded. At the truck, Nolan embraced Caleb carefully around the ribs. Then he drove away. He did not call Warren Slate again. The partnership papers were signed in January. The lawyer, Ruth Calder, asked Lena what she believed she was receiving. Authority with consequence, Lena said. She asked Caleb what he believed he was giving. Nothing I was not already depending on. Ruth looked at both of them. Those are unusually honest answers. May witnessed the signatures. Nolan reviewed the document and added 2 protections Lena had not considered. Miriam Voss signed a statement supporting the projected water efficiency. The brass key remained with Lena. Winter tested the ranch without drama. That was its own victory. The pond held, the haze lasted, the cattle came through lean but healthy. No emergency fuel delivery arrived in February. No feed truck came on credit. By March, Red Willow had not become prosperous. It had become stable enough to make choices before choices became emergencies. In April, Lena rebuilt Miriam Voss's splitter box. In May, she trained Levi to manage night turns. Orrin took over bank inspections and became so exacting about gate marks that May accused him of developing a personality. The south pasture returned heavier than expected where the storm had laid silt. Caleb stood among the grass and admitted Lena had been right not to water it in September. Lena admitted the flood had done work neither of them planned. They disagreed about whether that counted as evidence. The argument lasted until June. Warren Slate made one final visit. He stood beside the headgate while water moved cleanly into the main ditch. I am withdrawing the offer, he said. Caleb replied, I declined it 3 times. I am aware. Slate looked at Lena. You changed the value of the place. No, she said. We changed what the place could keep. He considered the sentence. Then he nodded. That was as close as Warren Slate came to conceding anything. By August, 1 year after Lena arrived, Red Willow used its full scheduled share without taking one unauthorized minute. The upper field carried a strong stand. The lower meadow produced enough to lease a small section to Miriam's sheep after cutting. Diesel irrigation dropped to emergency backup. May's ledgers showed the ranch had avoided more than $9,000 in combined fuel and feed costs across 12 months. That number did not include the value of the hay still stacked in the barn. It did not include the recovered pasture. It did not include the water share Warren Slate no longer expected to buy cheaply. Numbers were useful. They were not the whole truth. The whole truth was visible at 4 in the morning on the first full turn of the new season. Levi opened the upper check. Orrin watched the lower bank. Caleb brought coffee. Lena stood beneath the tin shelter with one hand on the cedar wheel. The headgate lifted smoothly. Water entered the ditch. It moved past repairs made in heat, frost, sabotage, and rain. It crossed ground that had once absorbed every mistake separately and now carried one decision into the next. Caleb handed Lena a mug. "You staying another year?" he asked. She looked at him. "I signed a partnership. That is paperwork. You sound like Nolan." I asked a question. Lena watched the dark front of water move toward the field. Her father's notebook rested on the shelf inside the shelter. She had added 72 pages since August. Measurements, failures, repairs, a storm line, a partnership percentage, a drawing of the South split and one sentence written beneath it. "Water does not care who speaks the loudest, it follows the ground." "I am staying," she said. Caleb nodded as if he had known. Maybe he had. The first water reached the west corner just after sunrise. Grass lifted under it. Cottonwood leaves turned silver in the morning wind. Red Willow Ranch was still difficult land. It still carried debt. It still depended on weather that promised nothing. But it was no longer a place where every leak worked alone toward the same ending. It had a system. It had time. It had two people willing to measure, argue, walk the ground, and open the right gate before pressure became disaster. A key had given Lena access. The work had given her standing, but the ground had done what ground always does. It revealed what could hold, and this time so did she.